Hey there! Tonight, we're going to step deep into the Appalachian Mountains, a place where legends linger in the mist and the past refuses to stay buried. You've probably heard stories about old mountain feuds, moonshine runners, and eerie family secrets passed down through generations. But what if I told you? Some of those stories aren't just folklore? What if entire families once ruled these hills with fear, vengeance, and blood? In this video, we re-diving into the world of the 8 deadliest Appalachian families you wanted to believe existed. These aren't just tales of wild cousins and backwoods justice. These are stories of real families whose names struck fear in their counties. Families tied to mysterious disappearances, unsolved murders, and decades-long feuds that left graveyards scattered across the hollers. Some were born into violence. Others created it. And a few? Well, no one's sure what they really were. So dim the lights, settle in, and don't be surprised if you start glancing over your shoulder. Because in the Appalachians, the trees have eyes, and the dead don't rest easy. Let's begin. The Appalachian Mountains stretch for nearly 2,000 miles, winding through 13 states from the deep south of Alabama to the stony cliffs of Newfoundland. But there is something different about this place compared to the towering Rockies out west or the broad plains in the heartland. The Appalachians don't boast size. They boast age. These mountains are ancient, some of the oldest on Earth. And dead, wrinkled, and folded in on themselves like the spine of an old man bent by secrets he's carried far too long. Step off the highways and paved roads, and you'll find yourself in another world, one where time doesn't to move forward so much as it coils, wrapping around generations like creeping ivy around an old fence post. The deeper you go into these hills and hollers, the more the outside world fades. Cell signal disappears. Towns shrink to a handful of weather-beaten buildings. Graveyards outnumber schools. And the silence settles into your bones like morning fog. There's something haunting about that silence, not peaceful, but watchful. In the early morning, mist hangs low over the valleys like it's hiding something. It clings to the trees, curls around rusted fences, and rolls across old mining roads that haven't seen a truck in decades. You get the sense that the mountains are breathing, watching, waiting. The people who live here, many of them descendants of Scots-Irish settlers who arrived centuries ago, have always understood the land in ways outsiders never quite could. Life here has never been easy. The soil is rocky. The winters are long. And history has a way of repeating itself when families grow up in isolation, generation after generation, with the same names etched onto tombstones and mailboxes. What you inherit in the Appalachian Mountains isn't just your grandfather's toolshed or a patch of land. It's his reputation, his enemies, his debts, his ghosts. And it is here, in this forgotten spine of America, that some of the deadliest families you've never heard of once lived and died. The stories passed down in whispers and campfire tales aren't always written in history books. In fact, most of them never were. That's the thing about the Appalachians. You can bury more than bodies in these woods. You can bury the truth. You can bury entire bloodlines. But every now and then, when the wind howls just right and the creaking trees start to talk, the old stories come crawling back. Stories of feuds so bitter they turned cousins into corpses. Stories of families who ruled their hollers with rusted rifles and cold eyes. Stories of men who disappeared after crossing the wrong surname, and women who never said a word about where the bloodstains on their aprons came from. In these mountains, family isn't just blood, it's law. And for some, that law was brutal. Outsiders often romanticize Appalachia as a land of front porches and fiddle songs. And while that exists too, there's a darker undercurrent running just beneath it, an inheritance of hard living, hard choices, and hard justice. The remoteness of the region meant law enforcement was often hours or even days away. In many communities, the sheriff was just a neighbor with a badge. So when trouble came knocking, families settled things the old way, with shotguns and silence. Vengeance here isn't just personal, it's traditional, passed down like moonshine recipes or heirloom quilts. If your daddy was wronged, it was your duty to right it. And if that meant another round of bloodshed, so be it. Feuds could simmer for decades, each generation inheriting the grudges of the last. Sometimes no one even remembered how it started, only that it hadn't ended. It wasn't just the Hatfields and McCoys. That feud, famous as it is, was just one fire among many in a forest of quiet wars. In the shadows of these ridges, countless other families waged their own battles, over land, over honor, over whispers and suspicions. Sometimes the fighting was open. Other times it was silent and chilling. A missing cow, a barn set ablaze in the middle of the night, a poisoned well, no police report, no trial, just mountain justice, and the land remembers. There are places here where the trees grow twisted, where nothing quite feels right, where the air thickens and even the birds go quiet. Locals will tell you it's just your imagination, or they'll smile that tight-lipped smile and change the subject. Because some names are still too dangerous to speak out loud. Some wounds never healed. Drive through certain parts of eastern Kentucky or the hills of West Virginia, and you'll find entire towns that seem frozen in time. Broken down mining camps, houses with caved-in roofs, churches that haven't held a sermon in 20 years. But if you listen closely past the creaking trees and cicadas, you might catch the echo of a shotgun blast from 50 years ago, or the hushed argument of men meeting at a crossroads at midnight, planning something they'll never admit to. That's the thing about the deadliest Appalachian families. They didn't leave behind manifestos. They didn't write their names in textbooks. But they left scars in the land, in the stories, and in the fear that still lingers. Some of these families were made dangerous by desperation. Poverty, isolation, and a fierce sense of pride created a pressure cooker where violence was just another tool for survival. Others seemed to revel in it. They built reputations not just to defend themselves, but to dominate, to ensure that no one dared cross them. Their names alone were enough to clear a room, to stop a preacher mid-sermon, to make a deputy turn his car around and pretend he didn't see anything. In this series, we'll be digging up the bones figuratively and perhaps literally of the 8 most fearsome families to ever haunt the Appalachian hills. Each one carries with it a different flavor of darkness. Some bathed in blood. Others cloaked themselves in religious fanaticism or criminal enterprise. But all left behind trails of grief and mystery that still ripple through the mountains today. And don't be surprised if, after hearing their stories, you start seeing the region a little differently. Because Appalachia isn't just a place, it's a character. A breathing, brooding force. It molds the people who live here, shapes them, and in the most twisted corners of its geography, it seems to spawn something darker, something colder. Before we move on, take a breath. Let it sink in. You're not just listening to stories. You're stepping into an inheritance of shadows. Into hollers where the past is never truly gone. Where silence is sacred. And where some family names still carry enough weight to stop hearts mid-beat. Welcome to the dark heart of the Appalachian Mountains. Let's begin. The Hatfields of West Virginia were not born villains. They were born into the rugged soil of the Tug River Valley, where survival wasn't a right, but a daily fight against hardship, hunger, and pride. They carved out their lives among steep hollers and shadowed ridgelines, where family wasn't just everything, it was law. And when that law was broken, the price was often blood. The feud that made them infamous didn't begin with gunfire. It started, as many Appalachian disputes did, with property, politics, and pride. But what made the Hatfield-McCoy feud endure in the American imagination wasn't just its violence. It was the way it pulled apart entire communities, turning kin against kin and holler against holler. It was a war without armies, waged with rifles, gossip, and generations of rage. At the head of the Hatfield clan stood William Anderson Hatfield, known far and wide as Devil Anse. Despite his nickname, Devil Anse was not an unthinking brute. He was charismatic, clever, and fiercely loyal to his family. He owned timberland, ran successful businesses, and commanded a kind of local respect that veered into fear. His authority wasn't granted by any government. It was rooted in his presence, his reputation, and the barrel of his rifle. The Hatfield-McCoy feud officially erupted in the 1860s, but the seeds had been sown long before. During the Civil War, loyalties were split. The Hatfields were staunch Confederates, while the McCoys leaned toward the Union. These loyalties, like many in the hills, were less about ideology and more about alliances and geography. Still, the wounds of war left deep scars, and they bled into every interaction between the two families. The first real spark came in 1878 over something as seemingly petty as a hog. Randolph McCoy, patriarch of the Kentucky-based McCoys, accused Floyd Hatfield of stealing one of his pigs. In a region where a pig could feed a family for weeks, this wasn't a minor accusation. The matter went to court, and in true Appalachian fashion, the jury was made up of locals, many of whom had family ties to the Hatfields. Floyd was acquitted. The McCoys, humiliated and furious, saw it as proof that the Hatfields' influence had corrupted local justice. Tensions escalated. Arguments turned to brawls, and brawls became ambushes. In 1882, 3 of Randolph McCoy's sons got into a drunken fight with Ellison Hatfield, Devil Anse's brother. Ellison was stabbed 26 times and shot in the back. Though the McCoy boys were arrested, the Hatfields didn't wait for justice to take its course. As Ellison lay dying, Devil Anse and his men took the McCoy brothers, tied them to some pawpaw trees, and executed them in cold blood once Ellison succumbed to his wounds. It was a turning point. From then on, the feud became blood for blood. Homes were burned. Men were ambushed. Children were caught in the crossfire. The most infamous night came in 1888, known as the New Year's Night Massacre. Hatfield men surrounded Randolph McCoy's home, set it on fire, and shot at the family as they fled. 2 of McCoy's children were killed. His wife was beaten nearly to death. Randolph himself escaped, but was never the same. The violence soon caught the attention of the nation. Newspapers from New York to Chicago painted the feud as a backwoods bloodbath, a relic of frontier justice. The image of the Appalachian mountaineer, as violent, lawless, and primitive, took hold in the American imagination, in large part because of the Hatfields and McCoys. But behind the headlines was a more complex reality. The feud wasn't just about revenge. It was fueled by political control, land disputes, and the economic shift brought on by industrialization. The Hatfields, with their timber interests, had much to lose. The arrival of railroads and out-of-state investors brought new tensions, as the old ways of doing business were threatened. Power in the hills was no longer measured just by family loyalty. It was now tied to contracts, taxes, and deeds. The feud, in many ways, was a symptom of a region resisting change. Devil Anse, perhaps realizing the tide was turning, tried to step away from the violence. In 1890, he was baptized in Island Creek, joining a local Baptist church. Some saw it as a true spiritual awakening. Others viewed it as a political move to soften his image and secure his legacy. Either way, Devil Anse lived out his final years peacefully, dying in 1921, surrounded by family. But the damage had been done. Dozens were dead. Countless lives were shattered. And the Hatfield name had become synonymous with vengeance. It took decades for the two families to truly reconcile. In fact, it wasn't until 2003, over a century later, that descendants of the Hatfields and McCoys symbolically signed a truce, ending the feud with ceremony and forgiveness. Still, the legend lives on. The Hatfields remain etched in the dark mythos of the Appalachian Mountains. Their story, retold in books, documentaries, and even Hollywood films, is a reminder of what happens when justice breaks down and loyalty turns into war. They weren't monsters. They were men shaped by a brutal landscape, bound by family, and consumed by a fight that no one could seem to stop. To this day, tourists visit the Tug Valley, seeking the graves of the fallen and the ruins of the feud. They walk the same muddy paths where Hatfield men once marched, rifles in hand. And as the mist rolls in over the hills, it's not hard to imagine Devil Anse himself, standing watchstone-faced, unblinking, a king in a kingdom carved by blood. But behind every gunshot was a choice. Behind every ambush, a moment of hesitation. And perhaps the real tragedy of the Hatfields isn't the violence they committed, but the peace they couldn't find until it was far too late. Tucked deep within the rolling hills of eastern Kentucky, far beyond the reach of paved roads and convenience stores, lies Pike County, a place where the fog clings low to the earth, like it's trying to hide something. In this forgotten stretch of the Appalachians, time moves slower. Folks don't talk much to strangers, and sometimes they don't talk at all. But if you stay long enough, if you're quiet and patient, you might hear the name Boggs muttered over coffee in a diner, or spat with bitterness by an old man sitting alone on his porch. To outsiders, the Boggs family was just another large mountain clan. But to locals, they were something else entirely. There are stories that have lingered like smoke for generations, of a family that ruled parts of the hills not with kindness or community, but with fear. Stories of moonshine still so well hidden no lawman ever found them. Of kinfolk who vanished after crossing the family. Of a sheriff who stopped investigating once he started taking their money. They weren't always feared. That came later. The Boggs family had roots in the region going back to the 1800s, when settlers first began carving farms out of the dense forest. They were loggers, trappers, and horse traders at first. But by the early 1900s, Prohibition changed everything. When the country turned its back on alcohol, the hills didn't. Corn liquor became gold, and the Boggs family already had what others didn't access. Miles of wooded land, natural springs for water, and a web of cousins who knew every ridge and hollow by heart. They weren't the only moonshiners in Kentucky, not by a long shot, but they were some of the most efficient and most brutal. They didn't just protect their stills, they erased threats. Local legends tell of revenue agents who walked into the woods and never came out. Of rival bootleggers who were found floating in the Tug Fork River, their bodies broken in ways that whispered of warnings rather than accidents. One tale tells of a man named Marvin Pike who tried to start his own, still too close to Boggs territory. Folks say he found a copperhead in his bed a week later, and 2 bullets in his chest the following morning. It's easy to write that off as folklore, but court records from the 1920s mention at least 6 disappearances linked to the hills near the Boggs homestead. None were solved. Their land, while beautiful, was no less treacherous. Dense undergrowth, sinkholes, and crumbling mines dotted the area like scars. Some say the Boggs family used those mines to dispose of enemies. Others believe they built their stills inside them, using the abandoned shafts as distilleries and escape routes. And when the federal government cracked down harder in the 1930s, the Boggs didn't fold. They adapted, started bribing local officials. Some say they had deputies on their payroll, young men who grew up in the county and knew better than to bite the hand that could make you disappear. But the moonshine days were just the beginning. By the 1950s, the Boggs clan had grown in size and ambition. Some branched out into timber, others into real estate, and a few, the darkest branch, as locals called them, dabbled in something more sinister. There were whispers of dogfights held in the woods, bets made on bloody contests no outsider was allowed to see. Of drugs, too, pills and powder slowly replacing whiskey as the currency of the desperate. But unlike many families who splinter under pressure, the bogs only grew tighter, bound by blood, secrecy, and silence. A journalist from Louisville once tried to do a story on rural corruption in Pike County during the 1970s. He spent a week in the area. Locals say he asked too many questions about land ownership, about missing persons, about a strange fire that had destroyed courthouse records 2 decades earlier. On his last day, his rental car was found off the side of a dirt road, keys still in the ignition, windshield cracked like a spider web. He never filed the story, said he lost interest. But those who knew him claimed he came back changed, quieter, jittery, prone to staring into the distance, as if he'd seen something he wasn't supposed to. There's one name that always comes up when talking about the Boggs clan. Elijah Boggs, the so-called Patriarch of the Pines. Born in 1919, Elijah was said to be a brilliant but cold man. He rarely spoke in public, but when he did, people listened. He ran the family's affairs with military precision, teaching his sons and nephews how to spot a tail, how to disappear into the woods in under 30 seconds, and how to hold a grudge longer than most men stay alive. Elijah wasn't known for mercy. One story claims that in 1961, a cousin named Ray Boggs was caught skimming profits from a still. Elijah didn't beat him, didn't shoot him. Instead, he banished him, exiled him from Pike County entirely. Ray was last seen boarding a Greyhound bus to Knoxville with 2 black eyes and a trembling hand. He never came back. No one ever asked why. Even after Elijah died in the late 80s, the family's grip didn't loosen. His descendants were quieter, more modern. Cell phones replaced CB radios, cash was laundered through car lots and gas stations. But the reputation remained. Outsiders still gave their property a wide berth. And inside the county, respect or fear was automatic. You didn't talk bad about the Boggs. You didn't mess with their land. And if a stranger came asking too many questions, someone always made sure they left before nightfall. Some believe the family's power has waned in recent years, that the new generation isn't as ruthless. But others say they've just gotten better at hiding, that their money is cleaner now, that their names show up on donor lists instead of court dockets, that you'll find a Boggs sitting on the school board, the zoning committee, maybe even the judge's bench. But ask around Pike County, and you'll still hear that same warning. Watch the woods near Turkey Creek, Matt's Boggs country, and folks who go snooping around there don't always make it back. There's never been a full investigation into the Boggs family. No arrests that stuck. No grand jury indictments. Because in the hills, some stories stay buried. And some families, no matter how dark their history, remain untouchable. Just beyond the last street lamp, past the rusted mailbox, where the trees grow thick and the silence feels too heavy. That's where you'll find them. Or maybe where they'll find you. Deep in the heart of Tennessee, where the forests seem to breathe and the earth groans under ancient roots, there once stood a house that nobody wanted to speak about. Not in daylight, not over coffee, not even behind closed doors. The trees grew thicker there, not just taller, and the wind never sounded right, more like whispers than rustling leaves. That's where the Brewster family lived, or hid, depending on who you asked. Locals in nearby towns like Dunlap and Whitwell called them strange. Off, not quite right. But their oddness wasn't just the quiet kind. It was the kind that makes a community watch from a distance. For nearly a century, the Brewsters were known as recluses, emerging only for supplies or during the rare occasion when their help was needed, for things that no one else wanted to touch. Some said they were cursed. Others believed they were guarding something far worse. The story begins in 1897, when Thomas Brewster, a war veteran with dead eyes, and a preacher as Silence, purchased a large tract of wooded land outside of Marion County. Locals assumed he wanted isolation, peace after the horrors of war. But as the years passed, strange rumors began to settle like dust. The first was about his wife. She was never seen in town after they moved. Some claimed she died during childbirth. Others whispered she was buried behind the house, beneath a crooked tree that never lost its leaves. Then came the tale of his twin sons, one born with a veil over his face, the other blind, but able to speak in tongues before he could walk. By 1910, stories had spread beyond the valley. People claimed animals avoided the Brewster property, that birds would not perch on their roof, that their windows stayed covered even in summer. Sometimes smoke would rise from the chimney in the middle of the night, even when no one had seen anyone enter or leave for weeks. But it wasn't until the tragedies started that people began to talk about a curse. The first death was a neighbor, a logger named Eli Mears, who had been hired to clear trees near the Brewster line. He vanished in July of 1912. A search party found his hat hanging on a fence post beside the Brewster property. His body was never found. Days later, the sheriff arrived to question Thomas Brewster. He never made it to the door. Locals said he stopped at the tree line, turned pale, and walked away without saying a word. Then came the drought of 1913. Nearby farms withered. Crops died. Wells dried up. All except the Brewsters' land, where the creek flowed steady and the trees remained green. When a group of desperate men tried to reroute the stream, a fire broke out the same night, one that destroyed 3 homes in town. No storm, no lightning, just fire. No one could prove the Brewsters were involved, but everyone knew. By the 1920s, whispers turned to warnings. It became local lore. Stay away from Brewster Hollow. Children were raised on cautionary tales about getting too close. One in particular was passed down in schoolyards and Sunday sermons alike. The Brewster Pact. It claimed that the family had made a deal generations ago with something in the woods. Something old and watching. Something that required blood to stay asleep. The story went that each generation, the Brewsters had to offer something. A finger, an eye, a life. In exchange, their land would remain protected, prosperous, while everything else around it rotted. Outsiders dismissed it as superstition, but those who lived nearby knew better. Even in the decades that followed, through the Great Depression, 2 world wars, and the rise of modern America, the Brewsters remained unchanged. The same weather-worn house, the same thick woods, the same eerie silence. Photos taken from afar always looked off, blurry, distorted even, like the land itself didn't want to be captured. One of the most chilling events occurred in 1958. A teenager named Gwen Collins disappeared after claiming she was going to take photographs of the Brewster home for a school project. Her body was found 2 weeks later at the edge of a dried creek bed, 20 miles from where she was last seen. No blood, no signs of violence, just a look on her face, wide-eyed, lips parted, like she died of pure fright. The medical examiner couldn't find a cause of death. Officially, it was ruled a heart attack. She was 17. And then came the dreams. Starting in the late 60s, residents in nearby towns began reporting strange sleep disturbances, nightmares of black trees, of whispering winds, of standing at the edge of a clearing while something ancient moved beneath the soil. One man claimed he saw the Brewster house in his dreams, that it was sinking into the ground like it was being swallowed whole. He stopped sleeping entirely, took his own life 4 months later. What made the Brewsters so chilling wasn't it just what people said about them. It was the fact that no one ever denied it. The family never gave interviews, never denied the claims, never tried to prove their innocence. They simply endured. Every time the town changed, they stayed the same. And every time someone tried to disturb them, they paid a price. In the 1980s, a local development company attempted to buy a portion of Brewster land. They were met at the edge of the hollow by a barefoot man in his 60s with one blind eye and a grin that didn't reach his lips. The developer, a man known for his confidence, backed away mid-conversation and never returned. That same night, the construction office in town burned to the ground. By 1995, the Brewster bloodline had shrunk. Only a few remained. A frail woman named Clara Brewster, who ran a small herbal shop, and her two nephews, who were rarely seen in daylight. But even then, the fear persisted. Local children were dared to walk the edge of Brewster Hollow, to leave an offering at the boundary: coins, feathers, dead birds. Most who tried came back pale and shaken. Some said they heard footsteps behind them, even when they ran. Others claimed they saw lights in the woods, not flashlights, but lanterns that moved without hands. In 2003, a group of college students decided to make a documentary on Appalachian folklore. One of their segments focused on the Brewster curse. They camped near the hollow, set up cameras, and interviewed locals. The footage that survived is mostly static, wind, and distant howls. Only one student returned to campus. She never spoke about what happened. Not once. She dropped out the following semester. Her footage remains unreleased. Today, the Brewster land is technically abandoned, overgrown. The house is said to be collapsed, rotting into the earth, but few dare to verify it. Locals say the land still hums, still breathes. Some claim that Clara's grave is fresh, that someone tends to it, that birds still refuse to sing near the old trail. And then there's the new story. A hiker, 2 years ago, took a wrong turn during a solo trip and found herself deep in the woods, far from any marked path. She stumbled upon a clearing, said the trees there were twisted in strange ways, like they'd grown around something invisible. In the center of the clearing, she found a stone altar covered in moss. She took a single photo. When she returned home, every image on her phone was gone, except one. It showed the altar clearly, and beside it, barely visible in the shadow, the outline of a man with hollow eyes and a grin that didn't reach his lips. She never returned to Tennessee. So was it all superstition? Coincidence? Backwoods fear passed down from generation to generation? Or was there something deeper, something darker, an ancient promise whispered in the hills long before the Brewsters ever arrived? No one can say for sure. But if you ever find yourself hiking through eastern Tennessee, and you come upon a stretch of forest where the air feels heavier, where the birds stop singing and the trees lean inward like they're watching, turn around, because you might be standing in Brewster Hollow. And the curse, if it ever truly ended, doesn't take kindly to strangers. Deep in the hollows of southwestern Virginia, where the fog clings to the treetops like whispers of the past, there sits the rotting shell of a once bustling mining camp. The buildings have collapsed. Rusting equipment lies tangled in vines. And below it all, the mouth of an old coal shaft gapes like a black wound in the earth. Locals call it the Devil's Mouth. But officially, it was once part of the Riddle Mining Company, owned and operated by the reclusive, secretive Riddle family. The Riddles didn't appear in town often, but when they did, people took notice. They were tall, pale, and quiet, their speech clipped, their eyes strangely heavy. Some say they were part Welsh, part Cherokee, and part something else entirely, something old and unknowable. But what really made them memorable were the stories whispered about them. Not just of bootlegging or bar brawls, like most Appalachian legends, but of people vanishing near their land. Stories of screams echoing from sealed shafts. Stories of shadows moving underground long after the mining stopped. To understand the fear surrounding the Riddles, you have to look back to the 1920s, when the mining industry exploded across the region. Towns like Norton, Appalachia, and St. Paul saw booms of immigrant labor, many from Eastern Europe, looking for work in the black veins of coal that ran under the mountains. It was dangerous work, underpaid, and brutal. But when the Riddles opened their mine near Black Hollow, dozens lined up. The Riddles paid better. They supplied decent housing. They even had their own doctor, an old man who rarely spoke and always wore gloves, even in summer. At first, things seemed normal. The mine was productive, if a bit unconventional. It was deeper than most, with odd shafts that spiraled rather than sloped. Workers claimed the tunnels didn't follow the coal seams logically. They often heard dripping water where there shouldn't be any, and the air had a strange metallic taste like blood or iron shavings. Men joked about ghosts and goblins. They blamed the unsettling atmosphere on bad lighting or the isolation. But then the disappearances began. The first was a young Hungarian named Joseph. He failed to report for his night shift one stormy Thursday. The Riddles said he had quit, packed his things, and left in the night. But his bunkmates swore his belongings were still there, untouched. A week later, a Welsh foreman named Thomas fell behind during a shaft inspection and was never seen again. The official report said collapse, but no debris was found, and his helmet was later discovered lying neatly by the elevator lift. By 1932, 10 miners had vanished. 10, all under vague, unsatisfying circumstances. Every time it happened, the Riddles filed the paperwork, handed out hush money, and kept digging. When a federal inspector arrived in early 1933, he reportedly left after one day, white-faced and silent. His written report simply read, operational though unconventional. The following year, the mine was abruptly shuttered. No official reason. No public explanation. Just boarded-up entrances and a few unmarked graves on the hill. The Riddle family disappeared not long after. Their estate was sold off in pieces. The main house, a sagging mansion with stained glass windows depicting strange symbols, was burned down in the 1940s under mysterious circumstances. Only the chimney remains, blackened like a lightning strike. For decades, the story faded into obscurity, just another ghost tale among many. But in 1986, a group of amateur explorers, led by a Virginia Tech student named Carl Beasley, broke into the sealed shaft one October evening. Armed with flashlights and crude maps, they descended into the Riddle tunnels. Carl was a skeptic. He wanted to prove there was nothing mysterious down there, just old stone and forgotten equipment. They didn't come out for 36 hours. When they finally emerged, dazed and dehydrated, 2 members of the group were missing. The others refused to speak of what they'd seen. Carl dropped out of school and moved west. Years later, he was found wandering in Montana, ranting about faces in the stone and a heart that beats beneath Virginia. A private investigation followed, but no new evidence was ever found. The shaft was resealed. Since then, few have dared to enter the area. Hikers report strange humming noises. Campers wake to find their tents surrounded by perfectly arranged stones. Some claim the woods smell faintly of sulfur and coal dust, even though the mine's been dormant for nearly a century. The Riddle name is all but extinct now. No known descendants. No surviving business records. And yet, stories persist. One retired coal geologist, who asked to remain anonymous, claimed that core samples taken near the old Riddle shaft showed materials not found anywhere else in Appalachia, traces of rare metals and magnetic anomalies. He theorized the mine may have tapped into something geologically unique or unnatural. Locals have another theory. They say the Riddles weren't just miners. They were guardians, protectors of something deep below something ancient and hungry. And when they failed, when they got greedy and dug too far, it punished them, took them one by one. Or perhaps, as the most chilling rumors go, the Riddles made a deal. A bargain struck in darkness. In exchange for wealth and power, they offered sacrifices. And when the mine closed and the flow of offerings stopped, something got restless. Today, if you walk the overgrown trail to Black Hollow, you'll see the rusted warning signs nailed to trees. Private property. Keep out. Unstable ground. But the air there is different, thicker, quieter. Birds avoid it. Phones lose signal. And sometimes, if you listen closely at dusk, you can hear it. The faint clang of a pickaxe echoing up from the earth long after the last miner died. The Riddle family may be gone, but their legacy remains. A legacy of silence, fear, and vanishing lives. Whether they were victims, villains, or something else, entirely may never be known. But in the hollers of Virginia, where stories grow as wild as the vines, the riddles are still whispered about, like a warning or a curse waiting to be awakened once more. In the blue-shadowed folds of North Carolina's Smoky Mountains, far from paved roads or city lights, there's a whisper that wins through the trees. It's the kind of story you don't repeat too loud after dark. A name you might hear in a lull between breaths, when the fire pops and someone leans in close to say, "They say it was the Cobbs who did it." That family always had poison in their blood. To outsiders, the Cobb family might have seemed like nothing more than a curious relic of the old ways. They lived in a crumbling house tucked between the mossy hills of Cherokee County, at the end of a road so narrow, even four-wheel drives had to stop and walk the last stretch. The Cobbs kept to themselves. Their land was filled with wild herbs, bitter roots, and medicinal plants. They raised bees, dried herbs in their smokehouse, and brewed teas that supposedly cured everything from fevers to snakebite. Some called them healers. Others called them witches. But what no one denied, at least not for long, was that death always seemed to follow them. It began, as far as anyone can trace, in the early 1800s. The first record of a Cobb family member appears in a faded census ledger from 1813. Miriam Cobb, midwife and root woman. She served dozens of remote mountain communities, delivering babies and concocting her famous bone tea, a thick, peppery tonic brewed from wild angelica, bark, and something no one else ever quite identified. People claimed it worked miracles. Fever broke, infections cleared. But if you asked what was in it, Miriam would just smile and say, "Nature's secrets belong to those who respect her." Respect or fear? In 1827, a local magistrate named Peter Gant publicly accused Miriam Cobb of sorcerous influence. He claimed her tonics killed his wife and caused hallucinations in others. 2 weeks later, Gant was found dead in his home, his face contorted and blackened. Official cause, poisoning, but no charges were ever brought. The magistrate's successor dropped the case. Witnesses grew suddenly unwilling to speak. The Cobb land was left untouched. This became the pattern, generation after generation. The Cobbs would appear offering salves, tinctures, and poultices to the sick, and when someone challenged or wronged them, tragedy followed. Animals died. Crops withered. People wasted away or were struck down by sudden, unexplainable ailments. Some said it was bad luck. Others whispered darker theories, that the Cobbs knew which herbs healed and which ones hurt, and that the line between the two was one they crossed often. By the late 1800s, the Cobb name had become synonymous with quiet menace. They never carried weapons, never raised their voices. But if a Cobb family member turned cold or distant, it was a sign to run, fast. One of the most infamous examples involved a traveling preacher named Josiah Tiller, who came to Cherokee County in 1891 with fire in his belly. He called the Cobbs serpents in the garden and accused them of breeding devils in the hills. During a tent revival, he claimed that he'd seen a Cobb woman, Nora, talking to a copperhead snake in her garden, and the snake obeyed her like a pet. 2 days later, Tiller fell violently ill. Witnesses said he began coughing up black fluid and rambling incoherently about roots in his stomach. He died that same night. Again, no charges. The sheriff declared it food poisoning. The Cobb family didn't say a word. What made the Cobbs especially terrifying wasn't it just that people died, but that they died in ways no doctor could explain. In 1904, a lumber mill owner who'd evicted the family from nearby land went blind overnight. No trauma, no infection, just darkness. That winter, his children all fell ill with a sickness that made their skin blister and peel. He begged the Cobbs for help. They gave him a jar of salve and said, "Use it, and pray you weren't too late." The children recovered. The father never regained his sight. By this time, newspapers had started reporting on the curse of the Cobb clan, though no journalist ever stayed long enough to write much. The mountains protected them. So did fear. In 1922, a government official named Ernest Mallory was sent from Raleigh to investigate complaints of illegal apothecary practices on Cobb land. He disappeared. His body was found days later, curled beneath a sycamore tree, his mouth packed with wild hemlock. Locals said it looked ritualistic, like an offering. Authorities called it a suicide, though no note was ever found, and Mallory had no history of depression. The Cobb homestead itself was a strange and haunting place. Visitors few as they were described hanging bundles of dried herbs from the rafters, jars of powders labeled in Latin, and shelves of bones and feathers. Children were taught to mix tonics before they could read. The family kept extensive handwritten journals, but no one outside ever deciphered them, not for lack of trying. In 1963, a Duke University folklorist named Andrew Keel came to interview the last surviving elder of the Cobb line, a woman named Isadora. He left after one night, pale and visibly shaken. His official statement read, "The Cobb family possesses knowledge that is better left buried." It said that Isadora died peacefully in her sleep, but her death marked the end of the Cobb bloodline, at least officially. The property fell into disrepair, the house collapsing slowly into itself. And yet, hikers who pass by still report strange smells: rosemary, smoke, decay, and hear faint murmurs in the underbrush. Some even claim the herb gardens bloom in perfect rows, untouched by time or season, as if someone is still tending them. More chilling, perhaps, are the rumors that the Cobb knowledge survived. In 1998, a woman in Asheville died after drinking a tea purchased at a local farmer's market. The seller, who vanished shortly after, had claimed it was ancestral mountain medicine. Toxicology showed a mix of herbs not typically lethal, but together created a paralyzing effect. The media dubbed the seller the Cobb woman, though her real identity was never discovered. And so the story continues. Was the Cobb family cursed? Or were they simply the last link to an ancient, misunderstood form of knowledge, one rooted in the earth, in tradition, and perhaps in vengeance? Some folklorists believe the Cobbs were practitioners of an early form of Appalachian hoodoo, blending native, African, and European traditions. Others think they were merely smart herbalists who understood how to walk the razor-thin line between healing and harm. But in the end, the truth might lie in their silence. They never defended themselves, never tried to explain. The Cobb motto, scrawled in the margins of an old journal, reads simply, "Those who know need no warning. Those who don't won't listen." Whether they were herbalists, witches, poisoners, or prophets, one thing remains certain. The Cobb family left a trail of bodies and mysteries that time hasn't erased. And somewhere out there, in the overgrown thickets of Cherokee County, a root may still grow that knows their secrets and carries their sting. Deep within the Appalachian wilderness of West Virginia, where dense evergreen pines press in on narrow hollows and mist clings to mossy boulders. Like memory lies the legend of the Tilley family, a name spoken once in passing, then swallowed by fear and silence. Some say they lived before the land was mapped. Some say they still live there, hidden beyond the reach of law and light. But one thing remains clear. The Tillies made rules, and their hollow enforced them often, in ways outsiders never understood until it was too late. The story begins in the late 1800s, with Jacob Tilley, a grizzled war veteran who supposedly discovered a spring-fed hollow so remote, modern maps never captured it. He cleared a small shack and brought in his wife and children. They raised livestock, grew their own food, and lived without neighbors or need for generations. They did not trade. They did not attend church. They did not send their children to school. And above all, they did not let outsiders in. To the Tillies, the world was something to hide from not join. Over time, the community called it Tilly Hollow. Outsiders were warned away. Hikers who strayed too near reported eyes watching from the tree line. Hunters lost tracks of game only to find themselves deep in unfamiliar territory at dusk. It's said that if you whistled near the ridge, the sound echoed back at you distorted, like laughter or a voice not human. The Tillies, the locals would say, had their own laws, and those who broke them were dealt with swiftly. One of the most haunting records of this hollow comes not from official archives, but from the yellowed pages of a journal discovered in 1978. A traveling writer and folklorist named Eleanor Finch had disappeared from her car near a dirt road in Boone County. Her abandoned vehicle was found with supplies and maps scattered across the seat, and a leather-bound journal sealed in its glove compartment. No one else on the trip came forward. But the journal, that journal paints a chilling picture of what she believed she'd stumbled into. Eleanor's entries began with fascination. The beauty of the mountains, the sound of wind through hemlock trees, the richness of life undisturbed. But then the tone changed. Near day 3, she writes about strange symbols etched in mossy bark triangles, with circles at their midpoints and footprints that ended abruptly at a ring of mushrooms. She notes a smell musky, herbal, something that reminded her of bees and forest rot. By entry 5, Eleanor describes seeing smoke rising from a hidden fire pit deep in the wood. She heard voices chanting, though no mouths moved. She writes about glimpsing a figure at dusk, a woman dressed in gray linen, hair wrapped in cloth, carrying a sickle and humming under her breath. Eleanor's last entry reads, "If they find my body, let them know I went willingly. If not, they will. They have not forgotten me." Eleanor never returned. Search parties found her journal weeks later beside a dry creek bed, but no sign of Eleanor herself. Some brush off the entry as embellished storytelling. But the journal has since disappeared from police evidence, and no record of what happened to it remains. Her disappearance became just another hush-toned mystery, filed under Boone County cold cases. Another strange incident occurred in 1952. A group of scouts camping nearby assigned to clean a spring found carved wooden stakes around the water. Inside the hollow, they believed they heard drums at night. One scout disappeared. His group left the area immediately afterward and never returned to their original campsite. Parents claimed it was fear. Others believed the Tillies had taught their children well. Stay hidden, stay silent. And when someone asks too many questions, make them disappear too. There are reports, though unverified, of a makeshift gallows in the clearing, long rotted, but remembered in stories. Whispers say that couriers or traders who tried to cross through paid with goods or coin in exchange for safe passage. Those who didn't pay simply vanished. Hollow justice, locals called it. Local law enforcement, when pressed, denied knowledge of any missing persons or arrests. But every justice was dealt quietly. Elders in nearby towns speak of a summer evening in 1938 when trailers broke down in deep mud near the hollow. The repairman went off into the woods to retrieve tools. He didn't return. That night, they heard chanting around the campfire. The next morning, only the tools remained in an organized pile, cleaned and stacked. No blood, but no man. The story passed generationally with muttered, "They made him leave." By the 1970s, modern hikers sought out Tilly Hollow in search of the supernatural. Few lasted long. One well-known filmmaker set up a camera at the Ridge S edge, hoping to film the sunset from the hollow. When she returned the next morning, the tapes were blank, the camera intact but disabled. On the SD card was a single word scratched onto it, Tilly, in damp, mirthless handwriting. The filmmaker quit town soon after. There are theories about how the Tillys avoided detection for so long. Their children married into nearby families, but never spoke of their roots. They buried their own dead on private land, leaving no public records. They spoke in hushed tones with Southern Appalachians, and maybe practiced a form of justice older than the settlers' one rooted in folklore and isolation. Medical examiners who investigated unknown remains, believed to have connections to the hollow, reported deep wounds, not from gunshots or melee, but from something like ritual bladed incisions. Bruising in odd patterns. Bones slightly shifted, as if rearranged. Examination notes read, "Unusual refinement," but the reports were sealed away. One of the few credible survivors spoke in the 1990s, a construction worker named Ray Morgan, who accidentally veered his truck off a gravel road near midnight. He walked upward to seek phone reception and came across a cabin lit from within single lantern in the window. He waved. A door opened. A woman in plain clothing offered water silently. He accepted, then stumbled backward as she emerged holding what looked like a ceremonial blade still dripping. He ran. He says she whispered something in a language he couldn't understand, and when he found his truck, the entire forest around him was silent. No owls, no wind. He didn't report it. He left town. He died in 2010. His wife refused to talk about what he told her the night he got home. Today, Tilly Hollow remains on few maps. It is marked now as private land or wilderness area. GPS signals fade as you approach. Property signs warn no trespassing. Violators will be prosecuted. Campers who ignore the warnings report hearing dogs howling at night inside the woods, even though no dogs are visible. Some families say they still hang witch balls' blue orbs in windows, thrown there generations ago to ward off evil. Others leave offerings at the road's edge, small bundles of mint, coins, feathers, or stones, as if appeasing a border guard who demands tribute in silence. And though no Tilly has spoken publicly in over a century, the name itself remains enough to still conversations in taverns or basements. A reminder that some families didn't just live in the hollow, they became the hollow, the keepers of a boundary no one dared cross, superstition or sinister truth. It may be impossible to untangle now, but whether they were hermits or judges, priests or killers, the Tillys define something primal in Appalachian myth, a depth of secrecy, a legacy of self-rule, and a justice enforced without spotlight or pardon. If you ever feel drawn to explore Tilly Hollow, listen first, for the silence, for the wind that doesn't rustle, for the echo of footsteps that aren't yours, because some hollow justice still stands. And if you walk far enough, it might still find you. Deep in the tangled foothills, where the Blue Ridge Mountains fold into thick forests, the name Redford still drifts through whispered conversations, heavy with unease and a warning never to be ignored. The Redfords were a clan bound not only by blood, but by an unyielding code of honor and retribution. Family whose obsession with vengeance ignited a cycle of violence, so enduring it seemed to stretch beyond time itself. Their story is not one of simple feud or rustic dispute, but a grim testament to how obsession can consume generations, how the thirst for revenge can twist into a legacy darker than any shadow cast by the mountain pines. It began in the early 1900s, though some say the embers were kindled long before. The Redfords, proud mountain folk led by James Redford Sr., had settled a stretch of rugged land marked by rocky ridges and deep hollows. Across the valley, The Clarks claimed their own territory stubborn and fierce as the Redfords themselves. Between these two families, the air was thick with tension, a silent war brewing beneath the surface of daily life. It was a land too small for two clans, so fiercely protective of their honor and their claim. The spark that ignited the feud was a night shrouded in cold mist and whispered fury. Caleb Redford, the youngest son of James Sr., was shot dead in a midnight confrontation that locals still debate. Was it a trap, a misunderstanding, or cold-blooded murder? Official records are sparse, the few notes that remain vague and heavily redacted. But in the mountains, news travels by word of mouth and lingering silence. The Clarks were blamed. For the Redfords, this was no mere loss. It was a wound carved deep into their pride, a debt paid only in blood. And so the cycle began. To the Redfords, justice was not found in courtrooms or lawmen. It was forged in the wild woodlands and cold mountain air, delivered with steady hands and the certainty of blood for blood. The mountain code, unwritten but sacred, demanded retaliation, and the Redfords were faithful servants. One by one reprisals followed. A Clark hunting party ambushed in the dead of night, their bodies found days later, hidden beneath the fallen leaves. A barn burned to ash with no flame-bearer, ever seen livestock lost to the darkness. Whispers of figures cloaked in black, moving like ghosts under the cover of fog. Fires became their grim signature flames that ignited with no clear source, scorching the night, but sparing the surrounding forest as if the blaze itself was a silent, deliberate judge. In 1937, an entire summer barn went up in flames shortly after midnight, confounding firefighters who found no footprints or signs of human presence nearby. The fire devoured the harvest, but the ancient oaks and pines that ringed the clearing remained untouched, standing sentinel over a wound inflicted with cold precision. Some said the Redfords had learned secret rites from an old mountain woman rumored to possess the fire hand, capable of summoning flames with a mere whisper to the wind. The Clarks answered in kind. Homes were reduced to charred skeletons, the soil around their hearths blackened and bitter with loss. Each act of destruction was a message written in smoke and ash. The feud was not over. It was never over. With every broken fence post, every stolen calf, every midnight shooting, the mountain's quiet grew heavier with dread. Travelers who stumbled too close to the disputed ridges vanished. Ellis Harding, a merchant carrying supplies through the valley in 1945, was stopped on a fog-choked path and never seen again. His mule was found tied to a tree, restless and alone. Search parties combed the dense woods, turning over every stone and root. But Harding was swallowed by the forest, erased from the map like a ghost. No one dared question the Redfords directly, and those who did quickly learned that some secrets were paid for with silence or worse. Disappearance became a chilling hallmark of the feud. Margaret Hill, a local schoolteacher who dared to speak publicly about the violence and call for peace, vanished one cold winter night in 1951. Her home was found undisturbed except for an overturned chair and a single sheet of paper scrawled with the words, "Blood pays blood," in ink that seemed almost to drip with menace. The official explanation was that she had run away, but the townsfolk knew better. To challenge the unspoken rule was to invite death, swift and merciless. Others who tried to break the silence or mediate between the clans met the same fate. Hunters, preachers, even lawmen disappeared into the shadows of the mountains, leaving behind only rumors and cold questions. The feud was a living thing, breathing through the trees and rivers, punishing those who dared to interfere. Through the decades, the Redfords passed their obsession like an heirloom, teaching their sons the sacred duty of vengeance. James Redford Jr., the son of the patriarch, once stood over the body of a Clark cousin who had come seeking truce. The man was dead, stabbed, but no weapon was ever found. When asked, James said simply, "The Redfords don't forget, and we don't forgive." The words became a creed, etched into wood signs hung around their homestead, whispered at family gatherings, and tattooed on the flesh of younger men, preparing to carry the feud forward. By the 1980s, both families were shadows of their former selves. The blood had soaked into the mountain soil, staining generations. Yet the fires still burned, the disappearances continued, and the shadows seemed to grow longer. The Redfords withdrew deeper into their mountain stronghold, the old homestead falling into ruin, but the legend lived on. Locals spoke of a Redford shadow, a dark figure glimpsed at the edge of the woods just before disaster struck, an ominous harbinger of violence. The land around the old homestead is now wild and overgrown, the barn's blackened beams sagging beneath creeping vines. No Redford remains to claim the land, and the few who remain in town avoid mentioning the name. But if you drive the winding mountain roads at twilight, you might hear gunshots echoing through the valley, carried on the wind like a curse. Sometimes in thick mist, shapes move between the trees' silent watchers, who carry the weight of an ancient vendetta. The story of the Redfords is a grim reminder of how the pursuit of honor and vengeance, unchecked and relentless, can trap families in an endless cycle of violence. It shows how the past, carried in the blood and memory of those who refuse to forgive or forget, can stretch its long fingers into the present, blurring the line between justice and obsession. If you ever find yourself near the ridge where the Redfords and Clarks once waged their silent war, take heed of the silence that hangs like a shroud. The mist may swirl thick and cold, and the wind may carry whispers not meant for your ears. Because vengeance, once awakened, never truly sleeps. It waits patiently, biding its time, watching from the shadows, ready to claim those who dare disturb its restless slumber. The Lennox name still sends a chill through the mountain air, especially after sunset, when shadows lengthen and the cold wind whispers through the pines like a warning. In the foothills of eastern Tennessee, where the mountains rise steep and wild and the roads wind endlessly through hollows choked with cedar and hemlock, the Lennox family held a grudging grip on the land and a darker grip on the stories that refused to die. Their feud with the small church that stood on the edge of their property was a tale soaked in bitterness, betrayal, and blood. It was a story whispered with reverence and fear, a tale too heavy to tell in the light of day, and one that locals still avoid uttering after the sun dips below the ridges. The Lennoxes were an old mountain clan, their roots tangled deep in the rocky soil, and their pride as stubborn as the ancient trees. For generations, they lived by their own rules, shaped by hardship and isolation. Many outsiders saw them as rough and unyielding, a family whose ways belonged to a time long gone. They farmed their small plots of land, hunted the thick forests, and maintained a wary distance from their neighbors. Above all, they guarded their honor fiercely. The arrival of the little mountain church, built in the early 1920s, was a crack in their world they never accepted. The church, a modest wooden structure with peeling white paint and a small bell tower, was erected by a band of traveling preachers who sought to bring faith and order to the scattered communities in the hollows. To the Lennox clan, however, it was a symbol of intrusion, a challenge to their traditions and way of life. The church's arrival is met with cold stares, whispered curses, and mounting tension. Its congregants were mostly outsiders or families with looser ties to the mountain itself, and they preached a doctrine that clashed with the Lennox's stoic self-reliance and suspicion of outsiders. Conflicts began quietly, whispered arguments over land boundaries, complaints about stray animals near the churchyard, and the Lennox boys shooting at church bells on Sundays to drown out the hymns. The preachers preached forgiveness and peace, but the Lennoxes answered with silence and threats. The divide grew wider with each passing year, fueled by mutual distrust and a history neither side cared to reconcile. One bitter winter in 1932, when frost coated the valleys and snow muffled the earth, the feud erupted into something neither side could control. The church had planned a Christmas Eve service, a moment of community and hope for the scattered congregation. But the Lennoxes saw it as a provocation. On the night before the service, someone set fire to the church's small wooden shed, which was used to store hymnals and heating fuel. The flames were quick, but the damage was limited, and no one was hurt. The church members whispered of arson, but suspicion fell short of accusation. Then, just weeks later, on a cold January evening, the unthinkable happened. The church itself was engulfed in flames fire, blazing through the wooden beams and shattering windows. The bell tower collapsed with a thunderous crash, sending a column of smoke into the night sky. The congregation tried desperately to save their sanctuary, but the fire raged too fiercely. No cause was ever officially declared, but rumors swirled. It was the Lennoxes, some said, punishing the church for daring to claim a place on their land. More chilling was what happened afterward. Pastor Samuel Graves, a young man who had led the church for less than 2 years, was found dead in the nearby woods, his body broken and bruised. His coat was torn, and his face bore marks of a brutal struggle. The official report labeled it a tragic accident. He had slipped and fallen in the dark. But locals whispered of foul play, of a punishment carried out by hands unseen but known. No one was ever charged, and the Lennox family denied any involvement. Still, a shadow fell over the hollows, and the church was never rebuilt. Over the following decades, the Lennox name became synonymous with silence and fear. Families in nearby towns avoided them, especially after dark, and the few who dared to speak of them did so in hushed tones. Strange occurrences began to plague the land around the old church site. Lights flickered in the woods at night, and the faint sound of a bell tolling could be heard on still evenings, though no bell had hung there in years. Visitors reported feeling watched, an oppressive weight pressing on their chests. Some said the spirit of Pastor Graves still lingered, unable to rest. Stories grew of a curse laid on the Lennox family, a vengeance born not of men, but of something darker. Some nights, people claimed to see ghostly figures moving between the trees' flickers of white, where no one should be. Others heard screams carried on the wind, raw and terrified, echoing through the hollows long after the last light had faded. The Lennox family itself became fractured. Some sought to leave the mountains, unwilling to bear the weight of the past. Others doubled down on their isolation, retreating further into the woods. A handful still live there today, rarely seen and almost never heard from, their presence like a cold stone against the earth. They carry with them the legacy of that night, the burning of the church and the death that followed, and the unspoken truth that some wounds never heal. Despite the passing years, the land remembers. In the early 2000s, a group of hikers unknowingly pitched their tents near the old church site. That night, a fire broke out, consuming their camp and forcing a harrowing escape. The hikers spoke afterward of an unseen force that seemed to push the flames toward them, and of voices whispering curses in the dark. None returned to those woods, and the site remains avoided. Local law enforcement remains tight-lipped about the Lennoxes and the church fire, offering only vague reassurances that the past is behind them. But those who live near the mountains know better. They know that some stories are not meant to be forgotten, that some names carry with them the weight of sorrow and terror, too great for daylight. If you ever travel through these parts, beware the fading light and the shadows gathering beneath the pines. The Lennox name still lingers there, carried on the wind, a warning that some grudges burn hotter than any flame, and some fires never truly die. In a forgotten corner of the Appalachian foothills, nestled between ragged ridges and mist-shrouded hollows, there once lay a county that seemed to exist beyond the reach of law or order. It was a place where the rules were written not by elected officials or courts, but by a single family whose name was both feared and whispered with a mixture of awe and dread: the Millers. Their dominion was built on whiskey, power, and the ruthless cunning of a family that understood the value of controlling both the barrel and the badge. The Millers were no ordinary clan. By the early 20th century, they had woven themselves into the fabric of the county's very existence, their influence reaching into every corner of society. Where others saw mountains in isolation, the Millers saw opportunity. They exploited the rugged terrain to build hidden distilleries, crafting potent moonshine that flowed through underground channels into the hands of desperate drinkers across state lines. Their product was legendary for its strength and for the price paid to keep it flowing. At the heart of their empire was Jeremiah Miller, the patriarch whose cold eyes and sharp mind earned him a reputation as both a savvy businessman and a merciless enforcer. Jeremiah's rule was absolute. He knew that power was maintained not only through barrels of whiskey, but through money, fear, and loyalty. Judges were quietly paid off, their decisions swayed by envelopes fat with cash or threats whispered in dark corners. Rivals who dared to challenge the Miller reign found themselves facing ruined businesses burned down, families intimidated, and whispers that some simply disappeared into the night. The sheriff was their cousin, a man named Silas Miller, whose badge was less a symbol of law enforcement and more a signpost for the family's dominion. Silas was known for his unwavering loyalty to Jeremiah and the Millers, enforcing their will with a cold efficiency that left no room for dissent. His deputies were handpicked, all bound by blood or favor, ensuring the county remained firmly under Miller control. Outsiders who came to investigate often found themselves met with closed doors and hushed warnings. The Millers operated with a duality that kept the county in a state of uneasy balance. To the townsfolk, they were both providers and predators. The whiskey they produced was the lifeblood of the local economy, offering jobs and income in a region otherwise marked by poverty and isolation. Yet the cost was steep. Families were indebted, debts often paid not in coin, but in silence and obedience. The Millers demanded respect, and they collected it in ways both subtle and brutal. One of the most notorious chapters in the Miller saga was the bitter war they waged against a rival distillery, operation run by the Connors family, who had attempted to carve out their own territory in a neighboring hollow. The feud began with small acts of sabotage, casks of whiskey poisoned, equipment destroyed, but escalated quickly. The Millers, unwilling to share their grip, retaliated with fire and intimidation. One autumn night in 1929, a blaze consumed the Connor distillery. The fire was so fierce it lit up the sky for miles. When firefighters arrived, they found no signs of accidental ignition. Rumors spread that the Millers had orchestrated the attack, sending a clear message to anyone thinking of defying their rule. The Connors, facing ruin and fearing for their safety, fled the county soon after, leaving behind empty buildings and broken dreams. The sheriff's department offered little in the way of investigation. Silas Miller was quick to label the fire as a tragic accident, dismissing all talk of arson as baseless gossip. His word was law, and few dared challenge it. The few who did found themselves on the wrong side of a system rigged to protect the Millers at all costs. But it wasn't just violence and intimidation that kept the Millers in power. They were masters of manipulation, weaving their influence into the political and social fabric of the county. Community events were sponsored by the Millers, their name emblazoned on banners and programs. Churches accepted their donations with wary smiles. Local businesses depended on the whiskey trade to survive. To many, the Millers were an unavoidable presence, a force as constant as the mountains themselves. Despite their reach, cracks began to appear. The Great Depression hit the region hard, and as law enforcement from the state and federal levels turned their eyes toward moonshining and bootlegging, pressure mounted. Silas Miller's carefully constructed network started to unravel, and whispers of corruption made their way to the ears of prosecutors and agents. In 1934, a federal raid on one of the Millers' hidden stills brought the empire into public view. The raid was dramatic agents descending on the mountain with horses and trucks, shutting down the operation and seizing thousands of gallons of illicit liquor. Jeremiah Miller was arrested, his iron grip momentarily loosened. The trial that followed was the county's biggest spectacle in years, with newspapers circling like vultures. But the Millers' reach extended beyond the courtroom. Witnesses turned silent, evidence disappeared, and jurors were intimidated. Silas Miller and his deputies ensured that any threats to the family were quietly removed from the equation. Jeremiah was acquitted, and his empire, though battered, endured. The trial marked a turning point, not an end. The Millers adapted, shifting their operations and tightening their control. But the spirit of the clan, the code of power by barrel and badge, persisted. The old ways were fading with the coming of modern roads and new laws. Yet in the shadows of the forgotten county, the Millers' legacy still lingers. Today, few remember the county as it was under the Millers' rule, and fewer still speak their name without a glance over the shoulder. The distilleries are gone, replaced by legal enterprises and fading memories. But those who listen closely can still hear the echoes of gunshots and whispered deals, the clang of whiskey barrels rolling down dirt roads, and the steady footsteps of a sheriff who was never truly impartial. In the mountains where power was measured by what you could pour into a jar and what you could extract from a judge, the Millers ruled with law by the barrel, and their story remains a dark stain on the pages of Appalachian history. In the quiet outskirts of a small Appalachian town, nestled between ancient oaks and whispering maples, stood the Greer family home, an aging farmhouse that had once been the center of community life, and later, a source of whispered unease. For generations, the Greers were known as devoutly religious folk, pillars of the local church, with prayers said at dawn and candles lit for every solemn occasion. Yet behind closed doors, the family harbored secrets far darker than simple faith could explain secrets, hidden away in the dusty attic, preserved in journals, letters, and strange handwritten manuscripts that would baffle and terrify those who later uncovered them. The house had stood empty for nearly 20 years before a young historian, intrigued by local lore, was granted permission to explore it. What they found in the attic was a trove of cryptic writings that painted a picture of a family caught between devotion and dread, between faith and fear. The Greers were not merely believers. They were practitioners of rituals that blurred the line between salvation and something far more disturbing. The story begins in the 1930s, when the Greers were at their most prominent. Reverend Elias Greer, the family patriarch, was a man of stern conviction. A preacher with a booming voice and iron will, Elias was beloved by the townsfolk for his fiery sermons and unwavering guidance. But those close to the family spoke of a man haunted by visions, dark dreams of shadowy figures, and evil lurking beyond the veil of the natural world. He spoke often of the unseen entities that watched from corners and waited for the weak. To Elias, faith was a weapon, but also a burden. The family's journals, discovered decades later, detail a series of increasingly intense experiences. Maria Greer, Elias's wife, wrote of hearing voices at night, whispers that seemed to come from the walls themselves. Her entries grew more frantic over time, describing strange symbols etched into window panes by unseen hands, cold drafts that moved against the wind, and the sensation of being watched even in the sunlit rooms. Most unsettling were the ritual records kept by their eldest son, Caleb. He documented attempts to ward off evil, exorcisms performed in secret, and prayers written in a mix of Latin and archaic dialects. Caleb's handwriting grew shaky, words crossed out and rewritten, as if the very act of writing was a struggle against forces beyond comprehension. One entry describes an exorcism of the family dog, who had begun growling at empty corners and refusing to enter certain rooms. Another recounts a midnight ceremony where the family gathered to invoke protection, lighting candles arranged in a circle and chanting words that seemed to twist and turn in meaning. The community knew little of these activities. Outwardly, the Greers attended church every Sunday, led prayer meetings, and were seen as examples of virtue. But rumors simmered. Neighbors spoke of strange noises after dark, chanting the crackling of fire in the hearth when no one was home and once. A bloodied handprint found on the side of the barn, smeared and faded before anyone could identify its origin. The turning point came in 1947 when the youngest daughter, Ruth, disappeared without a trace. She had been last seen near the woods on the edge of the property, chasing after a stray cat that vanished into the shadows. Search parties combed the forest for weeks, but no sign of Ruth was ever found. The Greers retreated into themselves, and the house soon grew silent except for the creak of settling boards and the whispers of the wind. Years later, when the house was finally abandoned, the attic remained locked and untouched until it was opened by the historian, who uncovered the trove of documents. Among them was a leather-bound journal belonging to Reverend Elias himself. In it, he confessed to believing that the family was chosen to stand as a barrier between the town and something dark, a veil, separating the world from malevolent spirits. Yet his words were tinged with doubt and fear, hinting that the protection might come at a terrible cost. The final entries of Elias's journal are fragmented and chilling. He describes nights spent standing guard, clutching a cross and reciting prayers, hearing footsteps in the attic, and whispers just beyond hearing. He questioned whether they were the guardians or prisoners of the dark forces that prowled nearby. The last page ends abruptly, stained with what appeared to be dried blood. A hurried warning scrawled beneath. The darkness listens. Trust no light that does not burn within. The townsfolk still speak cautiously of the Greer house and its legacy. Some believe the family protected the community from evil forces best left unnamed, while others fear the rituals only invited darkness into the land. The house remains empty, its windows staring blankly into the woods, a silent monument to a family caught in the grip of faith, fear, and the unknown. If you ever pass by on a cold night and hear faint chanting or see flickering candlelight behind the boarded windows, perhaps it is the Greers still fighting their unseen battle, a reminder that sometimes the line between protection and obsession is thinner than a prayer whispered in the dark. In the heart of the Appalachian Mountains, where jagged ridges meet the rolling fog and forgotten hollows hold their breath beneath thick canopies of pine, the name Boyd once commanded respect and a quiet kind of fear. The Boyds were a powerful family, their fortunes built on the coal veins that ran deep beneath the mountain soil. For decades, their mines fed the engines of industry, their name etched into town signs, ledger books, and whispered conversations. But by the 1960s, the mines began to dry up, and with the coal went the wealth, the influence, and some say, the very soul of the Boyd bloodline. The story of the Boyds is one of rise and fall, but unlike many tales of lost fortunes, theirs carries a darkness beyond economic ruin, a creeping shadow that swallowed a family whole and left behind nothing but overgrown graves and unmarked trails where children once played. At their height, the Boyds owned vast tracts of land and operated one of the largest mining companies in the region. The patriarch Samuel Boyd was a man known for his iron will and cold pragmatism. His rule was absolute, and his ambitions stretched far beyond the coal pits. He built schools, funded churches, and established businesses, cementing the family's dominance, not just through industry, but through community influence. Yet beneath the surface of their prosperity lay tensions, old resentments between labor and management, whispers of exploitation, and rumors of debts that could never be repaid. The mines were brutal places, carved into the mountain like wounds, dark tunnels where men worked until their bodies broke or the earth swallowed them. It was said that the mines held more than just coal. Old curses, bad luck, and stories of men lost to the shadows. Miners spoke in hushed tones about strange lights flickering in the depths, ghostly figures seen in the shafts, and an oppressive silence that could smother a man's soul. Samuel Boyd dismissed such talk as superstition, Yet even he grew wary as accidents mounted and workers vanished without explanation. The turning point came in the late 1950s. The richest veins began to run dry, and the Boyd's empire started to crumble. Miners were laid off, businesses shuttered, and families forced to leave the only home they'd ever known. The Boyds themselves retreated to their ancestral home, a sprawling, weathered mansion perched on a ridge overlooking the town. But isolation did little to heal the fractures within the family. As the mines closed, a different kind of darkness took hold. Samuel's eldest son, Thomas Boyd, began to withdraw from the world. Once a charismatic leader, Thomas became a shadow rumored to wander the halls late at night, muttering to himself and scrawling strange symbols on the walls of his study. His younger sister Evelyn spoke of a family curse, a shadow that clung to their bloodline like a sickness. She told friends that the mountain was angry, that the earth beneath them was restless, and that their family was marked for disappearance. Then, one by one, the Boyds began to vanish. The first was Thomas. One autumn evening in 1963, after a storm had swept through the mountains and washed out the roads, Thomas was last seen walking into the forest near the old mine. Search parties combed the woods, but he was never found. His belongings remained in the mansion, his coat on the chair, a half-finished letter on the desk, but no sign of him beyond that. Evelyn disappeared 3 years later. She was last spotted at the edge of a nearby creek, her face pale and distant, as if listening to voices none could hear. She left behind a journal filled with cryptic entries, references to the mountain's hunger and the silence waiting beneath the trees. After Evelyn's disappearance, the mansion fell silent, its windows boarded, and the land slowly reclaiming what the family once held. The remaining Boyd's cousins, distant relatives, faced a choice: stay and face the creeping dread, or leave and sever their ties forever. Most left, scattering to cities and distant states. The few who stayed were swallowed by obscurity, their names fading from records and memory. Today, what remains of the Boyd legacy is a patch of land swallowed by wild-growth tangled vines, shattered gravestones worn smooth by rain, and trails overgrown with brambles that lead nowhere. The family cemetery, once tended with pride, is now a place where the wind carries whispers and shadows move with a life of their own. Locals speak of hearing footsteps where no one walks, of lantern lights flickering in the night, and of a low hum that rises from the earth itself, a mournful song for a vanished bloodline. Some say the Boyds were cursed for their greed, that their failure to respect the mountain's ancient spirit doomed them. Others believe the disappearances were the work of darker forces, ghosts of miners lost in the shafts, or something older and more malevolent that waits beneath the soil. A few older residents recall stories passed down from their grandparents' dailies of the vanishing lineage, a family taken not by choice, but by a force beyond human understanding. The Boyd story is a somber reminder of the fragility of power and the unseen debts owed to the land. The mines may have been silent for decades, but the echoes of a vanished family still haunt the hollows, a quiet testament to what happens when a bloodline fades into the mist. If you ever wander the mountain paths near the old Boyd property, tread carefully. The graves may be unmarked, but the past still watches, and the vanishing lineage may yet call out from the shadows, waiting to reclaim what the earth has taken. In the shadowed hollows of the Appalachians, where mist curls like whispered secrets around ancient oaks, and the cold wind carries the weight of forgotten sorrows, the Thorne family name is spoken with a mixture of reverence and dread. Theirs is a tale woven from love, betrayal, and a curse so potent it is said to have doomed every Thorne son to a violent and untimely death. It is a story as old as the mountains themselves, a tragic romance turned nightmare, etched into the fabric of local legend and whispered in the flickering light of hearth fires. The story begins in the late 1800s with Eleanor Thorne, a woman of fierce will and haunting beauty, who became the matriarch of the Thorne family after the sudden death of her husband. Eleanor was young, widowed, and left to raise a brood of boys in a land that demanded strength and cunning to survive. She was known to be both tender and unforgiving, a woman shaped by hardship and the rigid codes of mountain life. Yet beneath her steely exterior lay a heart yearning for love, companionship, and something beyond the endless cycle of toil and grief. Into Eleanor's life came a man who seemed to answer that longing, a traveling preacher named Caleb Mercer. Caleb was a stranger to the hollow, a man with a smooth tongue and fervent eyes who carried with him the promise of salvation and change. He arrived one autumn evening just as the leaves turned gold, and fire, speaking of hope and redemption, in sermons that echoed through the wooden church at the valley's edge. Eleanor was drawn to Caleb, captivated by his passion and seeming kindness. Their courtship was brief but intense, a whirlwind of stolen moments beneath the stars and whispered prayers in candlelit rooms. The townsfolk watched with a mix of curiosity and caution, aware that such passion could be both a blessing and a storm. Despite the murmurs, Eleanor and Caleb married, their union sealing a brief chapter of joy that would soon unravel into tragedy. What followed is shrouded in mystery and conflicting accounts. Some say Caleb was a good man who fell victim to the harshness of mountain life. Others whisper that he harbored darker secrets, old sins and debts that shadowed his footsteps. The night came when Caleb was found dead, his body broken and bloodied near the edge of the creek, the signs of a brutal struggle evident, but the cause and perpetrator never revealed. Some claimed it was an accident, others suspected foul play. But the truth slipped away into the mountain mist, leaving only questions and silence. In the wake of Caleb's death, Eleanor's grief hardened into something fierce and implacable. She was no longer the woman who had welcomed love. She became a widow consumed by rage and sorrow. According to legend, in her despair she called upon forces beyond the mortal realm, uttering a curse that would haunt her bloodline forever. It was said that the widow's curse doomed every son of the Thorn family to violent ends, untimely deaths marked by bloodshed, heartbreak, or disappearance. The curse seemed to take hold with cruel certainty. Eleanor's own son's young men, once full of promise, began to meet fates as dark and sudden as their father. S1 was found beneath a fallen tree after a violent storm, his body bruised and broken as if in a fierce battle. Another vanished without trace during a hunting trip, his rifle found abandoned and his tracks lost in the thick underbrush. A third was killed in a brawl that erupted at a distant town. His life ended in a flash of anger and steel. Each tragedy deepened the family's sorrow and fueled the whispered dread that the curse was real. The townsfolk grew wary of the Thorn name, crossing themselves when it was spoken aloud and avoiding the old Thorn homestead at the valley's edge. The house itself seemed to mirror the family's fate, windows dark and shuttered, the porch sagging under the weight of years, and the grounds overrun with weeds and wild roses that bloomed blood-red in the summer sun. Yet the thorns endured, their roots stubborn and tangled in the soil of the mountains. Eleanor lived to a great age, a figure both feared and pitied, said to wander the homestead at night, her cries carried on the wind like a mournful hymn. Some claimed to see her silhouette at the window, a woman broken but unbowed, bound to the land and the curse she had unleashed. In time, the legend grew beyond the valley, carried on the lips of travelers and chroniclers who passed through the mountains. Tales of the widow's curse became cautionary stories, warnings about love's power and peril, about the price of grief unhealed, and the way sorrow can twist into something darker than death. More recent accounts tell of the last Thorn's son, a man named Isaac, who struggled against the weight of his family's legacy. Determined to break the cycle, Isaac left the mountains, seeking refuge and redemption in distant cities. But even far from the hollow, the curse seemed to follow him. Friends and lovers fell away, accidents shadowed his steps, and the past whispered through every phone call and letter he received. Isaac's fate remains uncertain. Some say he vanished into the wilderness one bitter winter night, swallowed by snow and silence. Others believe he lives still, a solitary figure haunted by the sins of his ancestors and the love that cursed them all. The Thorne family's story is a haunting testament to the ways in which love and loss can intertwine, forging chains that bind beyond the grave. It is a tale of a woman's fierce heart and a curse that echoes through generations, a reminder that some wounds are deeper than flesh and some shadows never fade. If you ever find yourself wandering the mountain roads near the old Thorne homestead, listen for the wind. You might hear a woman's voice carried through the trees, a lament for lost love, a cry for redemption, or perhaps the whispered curse of a widow who vowed that no Thorne son would live free of sorrow. Nestled deep within the Appalachian mountains, where rugged ridges rise like silent sentinels and valleys disappear into the mists, the notion of a family being deadly carries weight far beyond the headlines or whispered rumors. To outsiders, these families, like the Redfords, the Lennoxes, the Millers, the Greers, the Boyds, and the Thornes, may seem isolated cases of tragedy or legend. But when you step back and look at the broader tapestry woven across decades and generations, a chilling pattern emerges. It is a pattern forged by isolation, blood feuds, economic desperation, secrecy, and trauma handed down like a dark inheritance. What makes an Appalachian family deadly? It is not simply violence or misfortune. It is a complex, interlocking web of social, economic, and psychological forces and ecosystem, where history, geography, and human nature collide in ways that breed both resilience and ruin. At the heart of many of these stories lies isolation, both physical and emotional. The Appalachian terrain itself is unforgiving. Steep mountains, dense forests, and narrow hollows make travel difficult, communication sparse, and communities fragmented. For families like the Redfords, Tilleys, and Boyds, this meant not just geographic seclusion, but a cultural and social distance from the wider world. Isolation fostered self-reliance, but it also bred suspicion of outsiders and an insular worldview where family loyalty could turn to ruthless protectionism. Isolation gave rise to a sense of lawlessness that was less about criminality and more about survival. In places where formal law enforcement was sparse or corrupt, as with the Millers controlling judges and sheriffs, families took justice into their own hands. Honor and reputation became currency, and blood feuds were as much about maintaining order as they were about settling scores. The Redfords' decades-long cycle of revenge, for example, was fueled not merely by personal vendettas, but by a cultural code that demanded retribution as a form of justice. Economic struggle is another driving force behind what makes these families deadly. The Appalachian region's history is one of boom and bust, of mines that fueled fortunes and then dried up, of crops that barely fed hungry mouths, of industries that vanished overnight. Families like the Boyds saw their wealth crumble with the closing of the mines, while the Millers thrived on illegal distilleries when legitimate economies failed. Poverty, desperation, and the lack of opportunity created fertile ground for conflict, crime, and the perpetuation of cycles of violence. Economic hardship also enforced secrecy and mistrust. In struggling communities, information became a weapon and a shield. The Greer family's secretive rituals, the Lennox family's silenced past, and the Tilley's hermit-like existence all speak to a desire to protect what little power or safety they had by shutting out outsiders and hiding truths beneath layers of myth. This secrecy is both a survival mechanism and a breeding ground for paranoia, with neighbors watching neighbors and family members guarding dark secrets. Trauma, both individual and collective, courses through these stories like an undercurrent. Generations carry scars, loss of loved ones, brutal deaths, betrayals, and the relentless pressure of hardship. The Thorne family's widow's curse is perhaps the most literal manifestation of trauma passed through bloodlines. But it is a theme echoed in every vanished Boyd, every missing Tilly, every burned Lennox church. These wounds rarely heal. Instead, they fester, shaping behaviors, decisions, and destinies. Psychologically, the burden of legacy can be crushing. The youngest Thorne's son, Isaac, struggling against a curse rooted in love and violence, embodies the human struggle against inherited fate. The Boyd family's slow disappearance after the mines closed is a quiet tragedy of loss and fading identity. The Miller clan's ruthless rule reflects how trauma and desperation can corrupt power structures and erode morality. Each family's story is a study in how history and environment shape the human psyche and perpetuate cycles of tragedy. Culturally, these families represent more than their own histories. They embody the archetype of the Appalachian mountain family, caught in the grip of forces larger than themselves. Folklore and legend grow from these truths, blurring the line between fact and myth. The widow's curse, ghostly lights over Boyd graves, or the Tilly's hidden justice become symbols of the region's struggle with its own shadow, its fears, its isolation, and its fierce pride. Yet, amidst the darkness, there is also resilience. These families, for all their deadly reputation, show the raw human will to survive, to protect kin, to carve meaning from hardship. Their stories are not just cautionary tales, but also complex narratives about identity, belonging, and the costs of loyalty. When outsiders look at Appalachia through a lens of stereotypes, poverty, backwardness, violence, they miss this nuance. The reality is a deep, often painful human drama where geography, history, and family intertwine. What makes an Appalachian family deadly is not inherent wickedness, but the weight of place and past, a legacy of survival that sometimes veers into darkness. In the end, these stories compel us to ask broader questions. How do environments shape human destiny? How do we reckon with trauma passed down through generations? And how do communities survive when cut off from support and justice? The deadly families of Appalachia are both a mirror and a warning, a reminder that history is never just history, and that the past always walks beside the present, in the blood and bones of those who come after. If you travel the mountains and hear whispers of the Redford's vengeance, the Lennox church fire, or the Greer's cryptic rituals, know you are touching the edges of something vast and complicated. These are not simply stories of violence, but echoes of survival, secrecy, and the human cost of living at the margins. So, what makes an Appalachian family deadly? It is the confluence of isolation and loyalty, of poverty and power, of history and haunting a tangled legacy, where the land and its people shape each other, sometimes with tragic consequences, sometimes with unyielding strength. The Appalachian Mountains have long been a land of mystery, a place where the mist clings to the trees like a shroud, where the roads wend endlessly through valleys carved by time, and where history is etched into every stone, every rusting gate, every forgotten foundation. It is a land that tells stories, but some stories are not spoken aloud. They live in silence, in the spaces between words, in the shadows cast by moonlight on overgrown paths. These are the stories of families who didn't just fade away, they disappeared. Some Appalachian families met their ends in the blaze of violence, or under the crushing weight of poverty and loss. Others were swallowed whole by the mountains themselves, leaving no trace but empty homes and whispered warnings. Theirs are tales of vanishing of bloodlines, erased not by death alone, but by absence, by silence, by the slow erasure of memory. Take, for example, the Boyd family. Once powerful and wealthy, their fortunes tied to the coal that powered the region, the Boyds seemed invincible. Yet when the mines closed and prosperity dried up, the family vanished like smoke in the wind. Their mansion on the ridge was boarded up, their graves untended, and their names slowly slipped from town conversations. Today, The only evidence of their existence are weathered tombstones half swallowed by ivy and trails that lead nowhere. Walk those paths and you might catch a flicker of movement in the corner of your eye, a shadow that vanishes before you can look directly. The Boyd disappearance is far from unique. Across the mountains, stories abound of families who simply stopped showing up, children left to fend for themselves, elders who walked into the woods never to return, homes abandoned as if everyone had suddenly fled. The reasons are as varied as the families themselves. Economic collapse, feuds turned deadly, fear of something unseen, or the crushing weight of generations of trauma. In some cases, the disappearance is sudden and mysterious, like a vanishing act with no audience. In others, it is a slow unraveling households emptied over years as people quietly left in the night, seeking escape from ghosts they could not outrun. The land reclaims what is left behind. The paint peels from weathered porches. Roofs sag under the weight of snow and time, and rust devours the gates that once marked the entrance to bustling homesteads. Locals who live near these forgotten places tell hushed stories. They speak of hearing voices carried on the wind, of lights flickering in empty windows, of footsteps on rotting floors long after the last resident has gone. Some warn against trespassing, saying the land itself resents intrusion, that curses linger like a heavy fog, and that those who dig too deeply might awaken something better left asleep. These vanishings are often accompanied by silence in the records, births, deaths, marriages, and even names wiped clean from census and deeds. It is as if the families never existed, their stories erased by time and neglect. Genealogists searching for roots find dead ends, pages torn from history, or documents lost to damp basements and crumbling archives. Sometimes this erasure is intentional. Families fleeing scandal or violence might assume new identities, blending into towns far from their mountain homes. Others fall victim to the merciless passage of time and the fragile nature of rural record-keeping. Still, the mystery remains. Why do some families leave such sudden, empty voids? Perhaps it is the weight of place. The mountains, while beautiful, are indifferent and often cruel. They demand respect, but offer little mercy. For families burdened by feuds, curses, or economic ruin, the mountains are both refuge and prison. Some choose to disappear rather than be destroyed, slipping into anonymity like shadows slipping through trees. And in that disappearance lies a kind of death less visible, but no less real. When a family vanishes, their stories become ghost tales, their lives reduced to fragments passed between generations around campfires or in quiet corners of local taverns. The vanished are mourned, feared, or forgotten, their legacies buried beneath layers of moss and memory. A disappearance is not always the end. Sometimes it is a passage, a transformation from flesh and blood to legend. The families who vanish become part of the mountains themselves, their names spoken only in whispers, their lives folded into the fabric of Appalachian mystery. They haunt the hollows, live in the rustle of leaves, and linger in the chill of a sudden wind. So when you travel these mountain roads, pause at a gate hanging crooked on rusty hinges, or step lightly through an abandoned yard tangled with wildflowers and thorns. Listen to the silence. Feel the weight of absence. Know that some families didn't just die, they disappeared. And in their vanishing, they remind us that not all stories have endings we can see, nor legacies written in stone. In Appalachia, some families leave behind more than memories. They leave behind shadows. And sometimes, those shadows reach out in the night, calling to those who dare to remember. Thank you for joining me on this journey through the shadowed histories of Appalachia's most haunting families. From curses and blood feuds to vanished lineages and whispered secrets, these stories remind us how deeply place, history, and human nature intertwine, shaping legacies that linger long after the last door closes. Whether legend or chilling truth, these families show us that in the mountains, silence often speaks the loudest, and some mysteries never fully unravel. If you found this exploration as gripping as I did, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more deep dives into forgotten histories, eerie legends, and untold stories from around the world. Don't forget to ring the bell so you never miss an episode. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Have you ever encountered tales of families who vanished without a trace? Or stories from your own community that echo these themes? Drop a comment below and let's keep the conversation going. Until next time, stay curious, keep exploring, and remember the past is never as far away as it seems. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.